This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Noodler's Heart of Darkness. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes. I'll take a look at some writing samples that I did previously on different papers. I'll compare Noodler's Heart of Darkness to similar inks from my collection. Noodler's Heart of Darkness came off the nib pretty quickly at first, but then settled into a nice uniform line, both in the writing and on the scribble, and I liked the feeling of the nib on paper with this ink. The swatch that I made with tweezers grabbed onto the paper really crisply, and a lot of ink came off here at the beginning and then faded into a nice charcoal gray color. The drip at the end of the swatch doesn't have the normal crisp edges that you usually see, and there's no sheen. I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. On nice smooth paper like this Tomoe River, this extra fine nib is very pleasant. Very little feedback, and the line is nice and crisp. This is a very nice ink to use with this fine nib. Next, I've got a Pilot Pereira. It has a fine stainless steel nib. Kind of surprised me, this little hard start I had here at the beginning, but this ink does appear to be one that kind of coats the nib. I dip these nibs in ink to do these writing samples, and after each time I dipped it I had to wipe it off with a tissue, and there was still a little bit of ink left behind, and I have a feeling that just kind of dried on the nib slit, and it just took a little while for it to get going. But once it does, I've noticed in this Pilot Pereira, this fine nib, it puts down a fairly wide line. It's a pretty, feels like a pretty wet ink in this nib. And it's smooth. Next, I've got a Sailor Licool. It has a medium fine stainless steel nib. On nice, smooth, ink-resistant papers, this has been enjoyable to write with, this Sailor Licool. Now, on some of the more absorbent papers, it did feel a little dry, but with this nice, dark, saturated ink, I'm liking the line that it puts down, and it feels really nice. It's got a bit of a pencil-y type feedback, but not unpleasant on smooth paper. Next, I've got a Quebeco. It has a medium stainless steel nib. This felt very nice and chalky. It was very pleasant to write with. I'm not a big fan, personally, of black ink in wider nibs, so that might color my opinion of this a little bit. It looks pretty flat. There's just not a whole lot of character to it, but it felt really nice to write with it in this nib. Next, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel calligraphy medium nib. I never know what to expect with this Pilot Calligraphy Medium nib. Some inks feel very dry and unpleasant to write with, but this one felt very smooth. Next, I've got a Quebeco Lily Put. It has a stainless steel double broad nib. This ink felt nice and smooth in this nib. I'm just not crazy about the way it looks, but writing with it was pleasant. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a stainless steel 1.5 stub nib. I haven't been very impressed with the way this ink looks in my wider nibs that I tested it in, but I love the feel of this ink in this nib. It's very velvety. Just very enjoyable to write with. While that dries, let's take a look at some other writing samples. On my Rhodia writing sample, the glass dip nib was enjoyable to write with, and the tweezer swatch that I do was crisp and surprisingly uniform. The only real variation in color is down here at the end of the drip. The rest of it is kind of grainy looking and more of a charcoal gray, and that's kind of the theme of my writing samples. As I was doing these, I kept thinking, this looks more like a charcoal gray. I usually like my black inks to be really inky black and opaque, and this one's just not very opaque, but I feel like if it had been called charcoal gray, I would have enjoyed the color I was getting. Everything felt pretty good here on the Tomoe River paper. The writing experience was just very enjoyable in the stub nib. I'm not crazy about how it ends up looking. It's all very black and not much character to it, but everything felt pretty nice. Heart of Darkness doesn't look too bad on copy paper, but as I was writing, I just had that feeling that the ink was spreading. Typically, when I'm writing with a fountain pen, I like to see the ink kind of float on top of the paper for a little while before it either soaks in or dries. And this ink, you can see by my ink smears that I did how quickly it soaked into the paper. The only one that had an ink smear was the Quebeco Double Broad, and I'm sure the 1.5 would have maybe smeared a little bit, but the letters look a little ragged, but it just felt like the ink was spreading out too much. The extra fine looks nice, but it was just a little bit scratchy. My Pereira with this ink just writes really wet. And on this thicker copy paper, it does bleed through a little bit. In my Leuchtturm bullet journal, it was very pleasant to write with using the 1.5 stub. It is nice and dark on this paper. It does still look, it's more of a really dark charcoal gray. And I just have to mention again that the stub nib was very enjoyable to write with on this paper also. No shading, just very flat and pretty dark. Noodler's Heart of Darkness on my Tsubame ink collection card looks more like a charcoal gray. And when I compare it to Noodler's X Feather, the swatch looked surprisingly similar, but in the writing, X Feather is a little more opaque and darker, and you can see that in the swatch, the tweezer swatch that I did up at the top. Noodler's black is a little bit of a warmer black, but it also gets much darker. And I don't normally like black inks that have shading in the writing, but there's something about Noodler's black that I do like it. Noodler's Heart of Darkness, though, in the writing comes across as more flat. I pulled Noodler's Lexington Gray because as I was writing with this, like I mentioned, it looks more like a charcoal gray. Noodler's Lexington Gray is more pale in the swatch, but surprisingly in the writing, it's closer to Heart of Darkness than I would have imagined. Aurora Black is a very popular black ink because it's dark and inky black and very opaque, but it doesn't have the water resistance that Heart of Darkness has. And I also have Diamine Onyx Black in my collection, which is very dark, but again doesn't have the water resistance that the Noodler's black inks have. For the water resistance test, I did a writing sample using Noodler's Heart of Darkness, Noodler's Black, and Noodler's X Feather. It was a pretty boring water resistance test. I submerged the writing sample in water for 10 minutes, and the only thing that happened was the Noodler's X Feather kind of blew out a little. It looks like the Noodler's Heart of Darkness may have blown out some, but that feathering occurred when I did the original writing sample. These were done with a glass dip pen, and Noodler's Heart of Darkness tends to come off the nib very heavily at first, and that's what caused it to feather. Okay, on the 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, no bleed through. A couple of spots where it got pretty deep into the paper, but no danger of bleeding through. When I saw the swatch that I made, I was a little bit concerned that this ink was going to have some shading, and I'm not a big fan of shading in black inks. And really, the only pen that was an issue with was the Quebeco Double Broad, and that's kind of surprising to me. It may just be that that large nib kind of drags the ink and it puddles in one area. The Pilot Metro, which usually writes kind of dry, looks decently dark, and it was very pleasant to write with, like the wider stub. When I'm using black inks, though, I generally prefer finer nibs, and on nice ink-resistant paper, I have to say I preferred the Pilot fine nib. I like the look of the Licool better. The Pereira was a bit smoother though, but it is kind of wide for a fine nib. This isn't my favorite black ink. I mentioned earlier that I prefer my black inks to be really opaque. I think I prefer X Feather. It's not quite as water resistant as Heart of Darkness and Noodler's Black, but I probably need to do some long-term testing. I know that X Feather does really well when left in a pen for a long time. It doesn't tend to dry out in a nib, but the water resistant isn't as good as that of Heart of Darkness and the regular Noodler's Black. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.